12 July the year 1871. A train of wagons with North American pioneers moving through the Black Hills and the vast plains of Montana, heading to the west for a better future in the land of promise. The beauty of the sunset and the scenery around them filled their hearts with joy, and the immigrants had no thought of any danger or misgivings about the Sioux Indians who live in the area, for their fears had been all dispersed by constantly received assurances of their friendliness. Slowly their wagons wound through the timber that skirted a river called the Little Box Elder, and crossing the stream they ascended the opposite bank when unexpected, without a sound of preparation or a word of warning, 250 Indians appear, painted and equipped for war, firing a single volley of guns and revolvers into the air. Suddenly the main body halted and sent out a part of their force which circled them around at some distance from the wagons. The leader of the surrounded immigrants advanced to meet the Indian chief and demanded his intentions. The chief immediately came towards him, riding forward and uttering the words, "Ho ho," which are understood to mean a friendly salutation. He assured them of his utmost friendship for the white people, then he shook hands and his band followed his example, crowding around their wagons. The Indians then asked for provisions and they gave them what they wanted. Nevertheless, they grew bolder and more insolent in their advances. One of them laid hold of the pioneers' leader's gun, but being repulsed, desisted. The chief at last intimated that he desired the immigrants to proceed on their way. Promising that they should not be molested, they obeyed without trusting them, and soon the train was again in motion. The leader of the pioneers saw that they were approaching a rocky glen, in whose gloomy depths he anticipated a murderous attack, and from which escape would be utterly impossible. The Indians urged them still forward, but the pioneers resolutely refused to stir. The Sioux Indians then requested that the travelers should prepare supper, which they said they would share with them, and then go to the hills to sleep. The pioneers concluded it's best to give them the feast, so the leader ordered 2 colored servants to prepare food and make a feast for the Indians. The 2 colored men had been slaves among the Cherokees and knew the Indian character by experience. Their fear and horror of them was unbounded, and their terror seemed pitiable. Each man was busy preparing the supper. Some were making the fire, others were getting provisions out of the wagons, a man was out some distance gathering wood, some were distributing sugar amongst the Indians. When suddenly they threw off their masks and displayed their truly terrible intentions, there was a simultaneous discharge of arms, and when the cloud of smoke cleared away, there was a scene with a sickening horror. You could see scattered corpses laying on the ground, pierced by many arrows and bullets, Indians on wagons, tearing off covers, breaking, crushing and smashing all hindrances to plunder, breaking open locks, trunks and boxes, and distributing and destroying goods with great rapidity, using their tomahawks to pry open boxes, which they split up in recklessness. Some of the pioneer men fled and survived by hiding between tall grass and sagebrush, where they concealed themselves, favored by the fast approaching darkness. The women and children who were in the wagon were taken captive, for it was a custom of the Indians sometimes to spare the lives of white women and children for ransom. Fanny Wiggins was one of those women that was captured by the Sioux Indians, and later wrote about her experiences in her book called Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians. Terror of the most appalling nature for the fate of the captive children possessed Fanny Wiggins, and all the horrors of Indian captivity that she had ever heard crowded on her mind. The slow fires, the pitiless knife, the poisoned arrows, the torture of famine, and the 1,000 nameless phantoms of agony passed before her troubled soul, filling her with fear so harrowing that the pangs of disillusion compared to them must have been relief. The first indication the captives had that immediate massacre was not intended was a few articles of clothing presented by a young Indian whose name was Vekala, who intimated that they would have need for them. Vekala brought also a pair of shoes and a pair of little Marys. He looked kindly as he laid these articles before Vanny Wiggins, intimating by his gesture that their lives were to be spared, and that they should have need of them and other clothing during their long march into captivity. He also brought her books and letters, and all of which she thankfully received. She readily conceived a plan to make good use of them, and secreted as many as she could about her clothing. She was planning to drop the books and letters that she received at intervals along the way, so that their friends may find and follow them to their rescue, or if an opportunity of escape offer, they would seize it and by their help retrace their steps. The property that the Indians could not carry with them, they gathered into a pile and lighted. The light of the flames showed the forms of the captors busily loading their horses with plunder and preparing to depart. When their arrangements were completed, they came to the captives and signified that they must accompany them, pointing to the horses and motioning for them to mount. This was the first reliable assurance they gave them that their lives were not in immediate danger. Soon they saddled the horses for the captives and started on, leading them out the valley of Little Box Elder. Vanny Wiggins writes about the moment they left the valley and says, "Straining my eyes, I sought to penetrate the shadows of the woods where our fugitive friends might be hidden. The smoldering ruins of our property fell into ashes and the smoke faded away. Night had covered the traces of confusion and struggle with her shrouding mantle, and all seemed quiet and unbroken peace. I turned for a last look, and even the smoke was gone. The Solomon trees, the rippling water, the soft night wind and the starlight told no tales of the disillusion and death that had gone before, and I rode on in my helpless condition, with my child clinging to me, without guide or support, save my trust in God." Traveling northward and through tall weeds and bushes, they left the bottomlands and soon after came to a creek which was easily forded and where the Indians quenched their thirst. In the darkness of their ride, Vanny conceived a plan for the escape of her 7-year-old niece and adopted daughter Mary. Vanny whispered and told Mary that they were only a few miles from the camp, and the stream they have crossed she should easily wade through, and that she dropped letters on the way to guide their friends in the direction they have taken, and that they would guide her back again. Mary then dropped gently down and laid on the ground for a while to avoid being seen. Then she retraced her steps and fled. After a while, watching an opportunity, Vanny also slipped to the ground under the friendly cover of night, and the horse went on without its rider. Only this time, her plan would not be successful, for the horses betrayed her. Being frightened at her crouching form, they stopped and reared, thus informing the Indians of her hiding place. The Indians used great violence towards Vanny, assuring her that if any further attempts were made to escape, her punishment would be accordingly. They then promised to send a party out in search of the child when it became light. Marching deeper into the wilderness, the Indians took paths inaccessible to white men, and made their crossings at a point where it would be impossible for trains to pass, so that they might avoid meeting immigrants. The scenery through which the Indian passed was widely grand. It now became serenely beautiful, and to a lover of nature with a mind free from fear and anxiety, the whole picture would have been a dream of delight. They proceeded on the journey until near noon, when they halted in a valley not far to the north of Deer Creek Station. It was a clear and beautiful valley where they rested, until the scorching rays of the sun had faded in the horizon. The Indians were determined to go forward, and they were soon mounted and started on. They traveled for days in exhaustion heat, marching through high, dry, barren lands and sandy hills until they reached a stream where they dismounted and camped. The stream by which the Indians camped was Powder River. Leaving Powder River, they passed through large pine forests and through valleys rich with beautiful grasses. Vanny Wiggins continued to drop papers by the way, hoping they might lead to her discovery, which would have proved fatal if anyone attempted a rescue, as the Indians preferred to kill their captives rather than to be forced to give them up. They marched further on through rocky mountains with transparent and noisy waters and fertile valleys, in which delicious wild fruits in great variety grows, till they reached a place called Crazy Woman's Fork. This country is scarred by countless trails of buffalo, so that what is often called the Indian Trail is merely the hoofprint of these animals. It was the 5th night of Vanny's journey with the Indians that she found herself under the weeping willows of Clear Creek. The Indian men who were tired were traveling, found a good camping ground and laid down to sleep, leaving a sufficient guard over their captives and at the outposts. After they've rested and recovered their strength at Clear Creek, they traveled through extremely difficult mountain passes and stopped at another camping ground where Vanny saw a possibility of escape. It was the 6th night. The way was far beyond her reckoning, and the woods where they are might be infested with wild beasts. But the prospect of getting away and being free from the Indians closed her eyes to the terrors of starvation and ravenous animals. Softly she rose and attempted to slip towards some growing timber. But the watchful chief did not risk his prey so carelessly, and his iron hand grasped her wrist and drew her back. Throwing her fiercely on the ground, he threatened her, which she momentarily expected him to put into execution as she lay trembling at his feet. She could only cry to God for mercy and prepare to meet the death which had long hung over her head, when a young Blackfoot, whose name was Jumping Bear, saved her from the approaching doom by snatching the bow from the Indian and hurling it to the earth. The Indian submitted to his intervention so far that he did not draw his bow again, and her suspense was relieved for the time. The terrible heat of the days continued, and the road they took was barren of water. The 7th night they entered the singular canyon, apparently well known to them, as they found horses there which evidently had been left on a former visit. The Indians had killed an antelope that day, and they gave Vanny a piece of flesh for a meal. They then traveled in a circuitous route for miles to reach the mouth of this canyon, and entered it just after sundown, arriving at the spot they selected as a camping ground. Vanny Wiggins writes about the ambience at the encampment and says, "They made fires whose fantastic gleams danced upon the rocky walls and added magic splendor to their wondrous treasury. The ghostly grandeur of these unfrequented shades cannot be described, but their effect is marvelous. They seem to shadow forth the outline of carving and sculpture, and in the uncertain firelight have all the effect of some old-time temple, whose art and glory will live forever, even when its classic stones are dust. Here I found water for my parched lips, which was more grateful to my weary senses than any natural phenomenon. And sinking on a moss-grown rock, near the trickling rill that sunk away in the sand beyond, I found slumber in that strange, fantastic solitude." Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to be notified about our latest videos.